Hello everyone and welcome to today's webinar, 21 Days to COP27, in which we'll be discussing what your business needs to know ahead of the UN Climate Change Conference next month. My name is Anna Stewart and I'm the Head of Sustainability Reporting and Engagement at Coles and a Director of the UN Global Compact Network Australia. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands from which I'm joining you today, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. I also extend that respect to all First Nations people present today. Shortly we'll be sharing a map in the chat box, so feel free to let us know in the chat where you're dialing in from. So we're here today in the lead up to the 27th Conference of Parties to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, otherwise known as COP27. The science really says it all. The slide on the screen now, sourced from the 2022 United in Science report, which is coordinated by the World Meteorological Organization, shows we're heading in the wrong direction. Across the globe, extreme heat waves, bushfires, increasing CO2 emissions, and of course, much closer to home, the devastating floods that are being experienced in Victoria, are all indicators that urgent action is required. Stronger climate change commitments at the international level are critical. Countries need to set short-term targets and turn pledges into action as we get closer to 2050. At COP27, issues including mitigation, adaptation, sustainable finance, and just transition will be discussed. And businesses have an important role to play in advancing all of these agendas, not only during COP, but throughout the coming years. The UNGCNA has worked with a number of companies through our Climate Ambition Accelerator program to help them make progress towards setting science-based emissions targets on the path to net zero. We also acknowledge the role of business in the just transition process, encouraging collaboration between different sectors to develop and implement carefully planned policies to support workers and local communities whose livelihoods are directly impacted by the transition away from fossil fuels. COP27 presents an opportunity for Australia to reposition itself with respect to climate change on the international stage. Under the current government, Australia has increased its nationally determined contribution by 15%. And the Climate Change Bill, recently passed by both houses, put into law the federal government's targets to achieve 43% emissions reduction by 2030 and net zero emissions by 2050. Today, we're really fortunate to be hearing from a terrific panel of speakers representing Australian business, government and academia who'll provide us with their insights on what we can expect from COP27. Firstly, we'll be hearing from Dr. Sally Box, Assistant Secretary of the Climate Negotiations and Engagement Branch at the Department of Climate Change, Energy, the Environment and Water. Dr. Box will be giving us an overview of COP27 and the current context as we head into the upcoming negotiations. This will be followed by a panel discussion, including Professor David Caroli, Honorary Professor at the University of Melbourne and Councillor at the Climate Council, as well as Natalie Kidd, Chief People and Purpose Officer at Intrepid Travel. The panel discussion will be followed by an audience Q&A, where you'll all have an opportunity to ask the panel questions via the Q&A function on Zoom. So I'd just ask if you've got a question of the panelists, perhaps wait till the panel discussion is finished and then make sure that you use that Q&A function, not the chat function on Zoom. And without further ado, I'll now hand it over to Dr. Sally Box. Thanks, Sally.
Thanks very much, Anna. I'm coming to you from Ngunnawal country here in Canberra, so I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land that I'm on here. Thanks very much for the kind introduction. I'm with the newly formed Department of Climate Change, Energy, the Environment and Water. I've been in this department in various roles in the past, but most recently came from the Department of Foreign Affairs and trade. But with the change of government, the international climate policy and negotiations came to this new department. So we have international and domestic climate policy together in this new department. So it's really exciting to be here, and it's an exciting time in climate policy. So this will be my first time heading to COP as heading the negotiations team, but I'll do my very best to give you an overview of what we can expect. Seeing the title of the presentation being 21 days to COP does fill me with a little bit of fear, because it's obviously it's very soon. Next slide, please. So just by way of introduction, the United International Climate Change Cooperation, its overarching objective is to stabilise greenhouse gas concentrations at a level that will prevent dangerous human-induced interference with the climate system. The convention is a framework document, and it's augmented by subsequent agreements, including the Kyoto Protocol and the 2015 Paris Agreement. And each year, the countries who are technically known as parties that have ratified these treaties meet at the Conference of the Parties. So this 27th meeting is being convened in Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt from the 6th till the 18th of November. And the Australian government sending an official delegation COP, and we'll be hosting a diverse and inclusive. So my team has responsibility for everything from looking at our negotiating priorities to actually trying to build a structure on ground in Egypt at the moment. And I'm not entirely sure which is the more challenging negotiation, I have to say. So at this COP, Australia is going to be playing an active role in the negotiations agenda to help achieve the objectives of the convention and the Paris Agreement. And I'll give you a bit of an overview of what some of the negotiating priorities are. We'll also have the opportunity to share with other countries and with international partners Australia's new targets and policies, and sort of build new partnerships to help us address our domestic objectives. A big priority as well for the Australian government is to work closely with Pacific partners to elevate their interests, including on adaptation, on loss and damage, and in calling for stronger mitigation action. We'll also be trying to bring a stronger First Nations voice to our engagement at COP through increasing First Nations participation, both at the Pavilion and in our delegation. And we're very much looking forward to meeting with a broad range of Australian stakeholders on the ground, from business to academics to non-government organisations who are all there sort of working together on this effort. So I'll just switch to the next slide if I can. Just to put this COP in context, I'm just going to firstly look back quickly to COP26 in Glasgow. So Glasgow was what we call a milestone COP in international climate cooperation. The UK drove a significant ambition agenda. It was a COP where countries were expected to update their targets, their nationally determined contributions. And we had more than 150 parties are now committed to net zero and have updated targets. And then a range of developed countries also agreed to double their climate finance. So it was a big COP for countries increasing their ambition. And it was also an important COP in terms of finalising the Paris rulebook. So this is implementing this Paris Agreement, and that was stitched up at COP26, particularly with the rules on transparency and carbon markets finalised. And we also saw a range of private sector commitments to climate action across multiple sectors. So that's what COP26 was. This COP's a little bit different. So if you can just go to the next slide, please. This is a COP after a milestone COP. There's not a lot mandated for decision on the negotiations agenda. There's a couple of things, some technical rules for markets, and then we're due to decide the structure and process, otherwise known as modalities, for a new mitigation work program. And I'll come back to that later. So there's more than 100 items on the negotiations agenda, but many items are at a midpoint and not due for decision at this COP. So there will be continued work on the global stocktake, continued work on a new collective quantified finance goal, continued work on this work program on how to assess progress against the global goal on adaptation. But most of these are due at next year or the year after. So it's a year to make progress, but not a year for sort of mandated big decisions. Nevertheless, COP27 does remain a really important check-in point. The real work, I think, is in building the confidence that the global transformation to net zero is underway, that it remains achievable and will deliver economic prosperity to both developed and developing countries. And this COP there's also a need for reassurance that vulnerable countries will be supported in their efforts to transform their economies and deal with the impacts of climate change. Of course, this COP also takes place against a very challenging backdrop. The war in Ukraine is exacerbating global energy and food security challenges, and there are geopolitical tensions associated with that. So it is a tricky backdrop for this COP. For Egypt, they recognise that this isn't a milestone COP, and they are very much pitching this as an implementation COP. This is a COP about turning ambition into action. And Egypt is very focused on this COP delivering for Africa on issues that Africa cares about, on adaptation, on climate finance, on loss and damage. And they'll be driving these outcomes through both the negotiations agenda, probably through that cover decision, like the equivalent of the Glasgow Climate Pact for Sharm, and they'll be doing that through initiatives. So this is really the focus of Egypt. In terms of the shape of the COP, it's almost like multiple parallel conferences running at once. So the formal COP program runs from the 6th to the 18th of November, but it has a number of components within it. So I'll give you a bit of a sense of what the shape of the COP looks like. Egypt is having a World Leaders Summit, the Sharm el-Sheikh, at the beginning of the first week on the 7th and the 8th. And that includes some high-level side events, an opportunity for leaders to give national statements, and a range of roundtables on topics from just transition through to food security, through to investing in the future of energy. There's 6 roundtables as part of that World Leaders Summit. In the second week, there's a high-level segment for ministers, and we're anticipating to have our ministers there in the second week. And then the negotiations run over the full 2 weeks, with most issues wrapped up in the first week, with draft conclusions agreed by negotiators, with unresolved issues referred to the presidency in the second week for resolution with ministers. And so that's when the ministers come in that high-level segment to support the resolution of the issues that don't get sorted out in the first week. So that's sort of the negotiations. But in parallel to the negotiations, you have this action agenda, which comprises of official side events, all the who are doing side events and creating new partnerships in the pavilions. And then there's the green zone, where civil society essentially has another parallel conference. So it's there's multiple things going on at once. The Egyptian presidency has created a range of thematic days for the action agenda, from Finance Day through to Science Day, through to Decarbonisation Day, Gender Day, Water Day. So they've tried to give some focus to different days in that action agenda. And at the Australian Pavilion, we're really trying to align our activities with those days and create some momentum around those issues that Egypt wants to show some leadership on. So there really is scope for Australian business to be engaged across the action agenda. For those travelling to COP, there are opportunities to showcase Australian projects and initiatives, network with international counterparts, and develop partnerships. For those who won't be attending, there remains a variety of ways to engage, including virtually in some events. Some pavilions will be live streaming some events, and obviously through considering the sort of the various outcomes that come out of COP. Egypt's also putting forward a range of new initiatives as part of the action agenda. We don't have a lot of detail on them yet. There's an initiative on African affordable energy. There's a new waste initiative with some waste targets for Africa. There's a food security initiative, a new initiative on nutrition, on low carbon food. There's a water initiative for water adaptation and resilience. So over the course of the next couple of weeks, some more detail will come to light about these initiatives. The Egyptian presidency has paired up with various UN agencies and the IUCN to give shape to these initiatives. So it's a little bit of watch this space. In terms of, so that's kind of where the presidency's heading. in terms of the key negotiation issues, issues include ambition through the mitigation work program, elaborating on the global goal on adaptation, discussing loss and damage, progressing discussions on a new collective quantified goal for climate finance, and advancing the global stock in the negotiations. And happy to take questions at the end. So we're really keen that for COP27 to deliver a robust mitigation work program to spur on mitigation ambition and effective implementation. This was a work program that came out of the Glasgow Climate Pact. We're really seeking the establishment of a work program that has a really practical effect in accelerating action and implementation and promotes ambition consistent with the goals of the Paris Agreement. Another thing on the agenda is to continue to make progress under what's called the Glasgow Sharm el-Sheikh work program on the global goal on adaptation. This work program was established to look at how we can assess collective progress on adaptation that can feed into the global stocktake. And the idea being that we can use that, if we can better assess how we're going, we can learn from that, and then we can promote better adaptation outcomes and action. The next thing is to build on progress in the dialogue on loss and damage finance. Funding for loss and damage arising from slow onset and acute weather-related disaster impacts from climate change is really a top priority for small island developing states and for the Pacific. So we're really keen to support discussions at COP that deliver outcomes that best serve the needs of Pacific Island countries. The other things that need to happen are for COP to fulfil its mandate to complete all that technical work on the markets rules. This is getting down into the nitty-gritty of reporting tables and things like that, but important to sort of give effect for those cooperative approaches under the Paris Agreement. As I mentioned earlier, we really want to continue really constructive discussions on the new collective quantified goal for climate finance. A goal of the Paris Agreement is to align financial flows with low emissions and resilient development. There was at COP27, countries will progress work towards a new collective finance goal to replace the $100 billion goal. And this decision is due at COP29 in 2024. So that work will continue. And then we also really want to continue some really good exchange on assessing collective progress towards the Paris goals and determine how to raise ambition through the global stocktake, which is due to conclude next year. This is a 5-yearly assessment of collective. It's conclude next year, and it's what countries will use to look at, well, how do we need to increase ambition in our next round of NDCs? So it's that stocktake process to inform the next cycle of ambition. So that's a very quick tour of things that are on the negotiations agenda. For those of you who are interested in keeping up to date with our priorities, we'll be holding stakeholder events during COP. We'll probably have one midway through just to sort of check in how everyone's going, which will be available to people back in Australia. And then we'll obviously have some debriefs afterwards. So we have I'll give you the email address in a sec as to how you can keep in touch with that. And lastly, I'll just mention that we do have an Australian pavilion. We had one last year. We're really looking forward to having another one this year. This is really an opportunity to have events and activities and displays to tell the Australian story, what our ambition and our action is on climate change, how we're working in partnership with the Pacific, how we're working in partnership with Southeast Asia to drive the transition to net zero, and a sort of a hub to build new networks and partnerships. And it's also a hub for Australian stakeholders who are on the ground in Sharm to come and meet with each other and meet with the negotiators and the Australian leadership team. So that's pretty exciting to have that. We've got some fantastic First Nations art at the Pavilion this year, and we've got some really great events planned, which we'll make available on the website soon. I'll just go to the next slide. I'm conscious I'm probably almost out of time. I guess I just wanted to reiterate that Australia comes to COP27, as Anna said in her introduction, with some new targets and a new suite of policies. So COP is an opportunity, I guess, to share with other parties to this global agreement the Australian government's new posture, new targets and new measures to help drive our economy towards those targets, and to share experience and lessons learned from other countries as well. So as Anna mentioned at the beginning, Australia's got a new target to reduce emissions by 43% on 2005 levels by 2030. We updated our NDC to the Paris Agreement in June, legislated those targets, and then the government is really busy introducing a range of new measures to support the achievement of those targets. So we have upgrades to the electricity grid to unlock greater penetration of renewables through investment in transmission lines and firming capacity. There's a range of support for renewables manufacturing and the deployment of new clean energy industries. The government's busy delivering Australia's first national electric vehicle strategy to accelerate the uptake of electric vehicles. And then there's reforms to the safeguard mechanisms to introduce these declining emissions baselines to provide this sort of predictable framework for industry to transition to the new low emissions economy. And then there's a range of other measures through the Powering Australia plan that are supporting that sort of whole of economy transition to net zero. In terms of our climate action outside of Australia, at COP26, the government announced a doubling of our climate finance commitment to $2 billion. This is a climate finance commitment that's largely focused on the Pacific and largely focused on what the Pacific tells us their needs are, which are largely around building adaptation and resilience. The new government has introduced a range of new climate finance commitments, a new Pacific climate infrastructure financing facility. There's increases in official development assistance for the Pacific, which we anticipate a significant portion of that will be directed towards climate change issues. And of course, there's some growing partnerships in Southeast Asia as well. So, COP is an opportunity for Australia to tell this story and share this new action, build new partnerships to help us both meet our domestic objectives, but also to look at how we can contribute to the global transition and adaptation in our region. So lastly, I'll just tick to the last slide. This is just to show how you can stay in touch with us. We do have Australian Government Climate Engagement Hub. It is still on the DFAT system, so that is not wrong. It's still the right place to go. If you register there, we can absolutely keep in touch about the stakeholder engagement events that are happening both on the ground at COP and virtually and also afterwards. So please register there. You can also follow us on social media, and we will be launching a COP27 website very soon, possibly next week. And on that website, we'll have all the details of the events at the Pavilion and updates from Sharm. So please register your interest and stay engaged. Thanks, everyone. I'll hand back to you now, Anna.
Thanks so much, Sally. Obviously, no shortage of issues to be discussed at the upcoming negotiations. We've had a few questions come in on the chat. I won't be able to deal with them all now, but perhaps just one or two of them. Sally, the question that's come in is Australia still pushing to host COP29?
Cut straight to the big question.
Yeah.
No, that's great. So look, the Australian government, as many of you know, this was as an election commitment to co-host a future COP with the Pacific. The Australian government is absolutely committed to doing that. They're very keen to bid to co-host a future COP. At the moment, we're looking at the most appropriate COP to bid for. What you might not know is that these COPs sort of rotate around UN regional groupings. So COP29 is actually the turn of Eastern Europe, and given the current situation in Eastern Europe and the fact that we understand that Eastern European countries, there are some countries who are interested in hosting COP29, that COP's looking less likely. The most likely COP for Australia to bid for would be COP31. That's the next opportunity for the Western European and other group, which Australia is a member of. That's sort of the next opportunity for our group to bid to host COP. So we're just currently having some conversations with the Pacific and who's interested before we formalise that. But there's still this very strong interest from the government in hosting a future COP. So watch this space and I'll keep you updated as we know more.
Terrific, thank you. All right, so we might now open it up to the rest of the panel. So Natalie and David, it would be really great to get your reflections on Sally's comments, and also, I guess, just your perspectives on the upcoming COP. And I might try and weave in a couple of things that have come in through the Q&A around Australia's reputation and how we're planning to improve that on the international stage going into COP27. And also, are we expecting countries to kind of, I guess, have lower aspirations given the economic headwinds that we're facing into? So lots and lots of questions in that. Sorry, but I'll hand it over to you, David, to start.
Look, thanks a lot, Anna, and thank you, Sally, for your excellent overview, both of the UNFCCC and the COP and what we're expecting in Egypt. And it's fantastic that Australia has now got legislation and stronger commitments for emission reductions for the Australian target, much stronger than the previous government, as well as other initiatives in terms of the electric vehicles and climate finance. But it's also clear under the UNFCCC that developed countries should be taking the lead in combating climate change. And the new legislation makes a commitment for the Climate Change Authority to provide advice on emission reduction targets. The only problem with the current government's target is that it's actually weaker than the Climate Change Authority recommended way back in 2014. And because of the slower rate of emissions and the importance of thinking about a carbon budget, Australia actually needs even stronger emission reductions by 2030 and an earlier date for net zero emissions. And all developed countries need an earlier date than 2050, because 2050 is the date for global net zero emissions if we were to limit global warming to only 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels. So businesses need to realise that actually the current emission targets are not a fair global share for Australia's contributions. Australia needs to do more and needs to have an earlier net zero emission target. But it's wonderful to see what Australia has already committed to, and there are plenty of opportunities for further updates and actions, both this year and in the remaining years of the current government.
Natalie, what about you? What are your perspectives as we head into COP?
I was really great to hear Sally's kind of overview. And I think our expectation also is that it is to check in and kind of be keeping that momentum. One of the points Sally mentioned about the last COP was kind of private sector commitments, and from travel and tourism, we had the Glasgow Declaration on Tourism, which was trying to move our industry forward. And so it really is that opportunity again for us to be checking in. I think within the tourism industry, it was great to see the commitment, but like other industries, would probably like to see more progress than what we're seeing at the moment. But it's a good opportunity to keep that conversation happening. Also really good to see Australia stepping up and really kind of, although we agree with what David said, that we need to see more, we're certainly starting to see progress in the discussion, which I think one of the things we talk about within our industry is just get people to the table, even if the steps are small. We need to keep moving in the right direction. So I think we're definitely moving in the right direction, and then hopefully we can continue to take even bigger steps as we move forward.
Great, thanks, Natalie. David, one of the things you've said is obviously we need to be doing more and faster. So we do have the kind of longer term, looking at 2030. What do you think in the short term, what are some of the plans and targets we're likely to see at a federal level that will align with the desired outcomes of COP? And Sally, if you wanted to provide an opinion on that too, very happy to hear from you both.
Look, I'll maybe go first and then pass over to Sally. Look, it's critically important that the sorts of initiatives like electric vehicle, but it's clear that Australian emissions span all the sectors, industry, agriculture, transport. All sectors need to recognise that a 43% emission reduction can't just come from reductions in, for instance, electricity generation alone. All sectors need to be involved. But there's also another key aspect. Most people aren't aware that Australia's contributions to global warming is much greater from the export of fossil fuel related materials, both coal and fossil gas. And if those were included, the so-called Scope 3 overseas emissions associated with Australian exports of coal and fossil gas, they would treble Australia's contributions to global warming. The 43% target only applies to domestic emissions and does not directly include Australia's export of coal and fossil gas. And therefore, Australia needs to both restrict future mining of coal and fossil gas and restrict exports of those important mineral products. But unfortunately, they are Australia's biggest contributor to global warming.
Sally, did you want to comment on that?
Yeah, sure. Happy to jump in here. I guess just in terms of reflecting on Australia's emissions reduction targets, the 43% by 2030, the government's been very clear through the legislation that this 43% by 2030 is a floor, not a ceiling. So that is the minimum we'll do. So I think that's a very clear commitment from the government that if they can do more, they will. And in terms of the shorter term efforts, absolutely endorse what David said, that we need action across all sectors. And we are seeing this government running very fast across a range of sectors. So we are seeing this transformation to the national electricity market with this objective of having 82% renewables in the grid by 2030, which I think up from 30% at the moment is quite a significant change. As David said, we're seeing this action through in the transport sector through the National Electric Vehicle strategy. With mechanism, we'll look at how do we ratchet down industrial emissions towards net zero by 2050. And there's a range of other initiatives in agriculture, for example, in terms of research and development and looking at how we can reduce emissions from agriculture. So while there are sort of, I guess, a few signature initiatives in some of the big sectors, the Powering Australia plan does look across the economy at how we might reduce emissions. In terms of the issue of export and coal and gas, what I'm hearing very clearly from this government is this government's desire to become a renewable energy superpower. So over time to, I guess, effectively support the regional transition in an orderly way to move from being an exporter of coal and gas to move to being an exporter of renewables. And so I guess if you think about, 80% in the national electricity market by 2030, that gets to 100%, and then it moves beyond 100%. And suddenly Australia's in a position where we, through green hydrogen or through, cables, the likes of the sort of Sun Cable project between Australia and Singapore, Australia can become an exporter of renewable energy. And I do really see that is the strong ambition of this government, and that provision our own economy to renewables.
Thanks, Sally. Just on that piece around, I guess, changing some of the industries away from fossil fuel, it probably lands us neatly into a bit of a segue on just transition. And I know that was something I was going to ask you guys a bit about later in the discussion, but I think it probably makes sense to talk about it now. Would be really useful to hear those views. What does a good transition look like, I guess, for impacted communities in areas like the Latrobe Valley in Victoria, for example? Not sure who wants to jump at that one first, whether it's you, David. You're nodding.
Well, look, I'm happy to comment, and it's clear that the transition to renewable energies, both solar power, wind power, wave power, tidal power, all of those opportunities involve distributed generation. And so this is actually a massive opportunity for increases in electricity generation from renewable sources distributed across many different parts of regional Australia, and to transition not just in the Latrobe Valley, but in inland parts of Australia, in Indigenous country, with support from the traditional owners for providing electricity generation across many, many parts of Australia. But what is also critically important, and to make this renewable energy transition occur, is a massive investment in increasing and developing the electricity network across Australia. And I know that the federal government has already made commitments to improve the electricity distribution network around a distributed network based on renewable energy.
Thanks, David. Sally, did you want to comment, or Natalie, on issues around just transition while we're talking about it?
I'm happy to jump in, Anna. So this concept of just transition has absolutely got momentum in the UNFCCC. So including in climate finance discussions with many developing countries concerned about and economic implications of climate policies and decarbonisation commitments. For Australia, the scale of the energy and economic transition that we need to undertake to get to net zero is huge, and it's really vital that we make this transition in a way that looks after the workers and really sees a wealth of opportunities in the transition to clean energy industries, and including new export industries. And the government is very strongly focused on the economic opportunity of this transition for the region in traditional industries. I think it's estimated that 5 out of every 6 jobs created by the Powering Australia plan will be in the region. So I think, the government is very committed to bringing the community along in this transition. There's funding for new apprenticeships in new energy industries as part of the government's Powering Australia plan. So from the government that they're very focused on this economic transition in a way that advantages the regions.
Great, thanks, Sally. Natalie, we might come to you. Just from a business perspective, one of the issues obviously we've had in the past is uncertainty around climate, and obviously lots of changes in that space. We have a more settled policy position now. From a business perspective, how is that assisting you and Intrepid Travel? And I guess, how does it differ to where we were in the lead up to COP26 last year?
I think, taking action, it's all about collaboration. And, what we talked about at the last COP, we went in really advocating for the industry that we work in and really talking about the role of business. But we know the solution is all about collaboration. So, we need governments to support and to push the agenda and, to help with the, important funding, the infrastructure and that type of thing. Our attitude in Intrepid has been very much about lobbying business, lobbying our own industry, but absolutely having the government step up, make these commitments is fantastic, because it really, supports industry across industries. And again, it needs to all be about collaboration. So I think we're certainly moving in the right direction with the kind of stepping up of the Australian government. And it's really exciting to see the commitments of the new government is really kind of helping move us in that direction. But I also don't think it should be entirely up to governments. Businesses really this needs to flow through, and businesses need to be stepping up. It's the businesses that need to be looking at what can they do differently, both in terms of, still taking actions and making reductions, but then also looking towards the adaptation as well.
So Natalie, just on that, what are, in your view, the best pathways for businesses that are on that net zero pathway? And I mean, I'm very happy for you to talk about Intrepid and how you're working to align your decarbonisation plan and strategies with the Paris Agreement.
Yeah, sure. So at Intrepid, because on one hand, we're proud to be really seen as a leader in sustainability and certainly on the climate journey. But on the other, we're a little bit disappointed that we are still seen, globally within tourism, we are punching above our weight in terms of where we're at. And that's not good enough, because we need the industry to come with us. So Intrepid was actually the first tourism company to have approved short-term science-based targets. We've now got the commitment for net zero. We've got the commitments for net zero, and we're working through what those targets actually are, and we'll have those in the next year. But we're really pushing within the industry to have more of the travel and tourism industry step up and also commit. Of 3,500 organisations with the science-based target commitments, less than 100 are in travel and tourism. And the impact of travel and tourism, between 8 to 10% of global emissions, working particularly within kind of transport, flights, these are real critical things to us. And that needs, the introduction of more greener energies. We know some of the airlines are really starting to work on the sustainable aviation fuel, and that's great. But for us, for us within Intrepid, outside of the industry, it's a lot of small steps. But we have an extraordinarily long supply chain. So our scope 3 is extremely significant. And so it is working with thousands and thousands of SMEs around the world. And how do we bring them on that journey? So moving to electric vehicles is something we've had great success in the last couple of months in Sri Lanka. And of course, everybody's seen the trouble Sri Lanka's gone through over the last 6 months, particularly around fuel. And so in some ways, that's really absolutely prioritised our need to be able to move to electric vehicles. And we've run our first purely electric vehicle trip in Sri Lanka in the last month. But it's really a whole range of these very small activities across a very extensive supply chain starts building up. We're doing another major focus for us over the last year has been removing flights where they can be easily replaced. So any flights less than an hour long, we're really looking at what are the alternates that we can bring in place of those to reduce those emissions, and we've been doing a lot of work there. But the reality is we can't move away from aviation, particularly when you're Australia-based. Aviation is a reality. It's necessary for us to work in tourism. So it's a combination internally of looking across the chains at all of those small little steps we can take. And then also where I guess government and the greater industry and across industries comes in to really make that substantive change to the way that we need to continue doing things. But the other area where we work within the industry to get people started is really starting at, you've got to start measuring. Commit first, then start measuring. And it's only once you've got the measurements, you can then start identifying what are the actual actions you can start taking. So we encourage people to take one small step and then another step, and we can build from there.
Thanks, Natalie. You've touched on Scope 3 emissions. David's also touched on Scope 3 emissions, and certainly I know it's exercising a lot of our thoughts at Coles at the moment too, given the size of our supply chain as well. David, I wondered if you might be able to comment on some of the approaches you're seeing to Scope 3 emissions, both at a policy level and also perhaps, from a corporate perspective, because it's a very big area that many of us on the call, I think, will be grappling with.
Yes, and maybe, excuse me, maybe it's important to just recognise that Scope 3 emissions are not always associated with overseas emissions, but are in fact associated with the sorts of emissions that arise from the sorts of products that are consumed by the companies, and so often involve things like domestic travel associated with the supply chains and the production or transport of materials that are being used by the companies. And that's obviously relevant to Coles, but is relevant to every single person, business, and government at local, regional, and national level, is that Scope 3 emissions are often perceived to be outside the control of the individual or business, but are actually within the control, but they need to think about how they design their purchasing or other activities, or the impacts of whatever they're selling or producing, and how that is then used overseas. So Scope 3 is within the control, but it's important to think about how, if you like, supply chains, how the products that are being consumed, where they're coming from, and that applies at individuals and level, but also at range of businesses and governments as well. And I think one of the things that's critically important is to recognise that at local government, at state government, and at federal government, climate change is important both for, if you like, mitigation of climate change, but as Sally mentioned before, it's the impact of climate change that we also need to address. And we've seen this in the impact of the flooding and extreme rainfall at present, as well as the bushfires and drought that were occurring in 2018 and 2019. They are affecting all people, all businesses, and all communities, as well as all governments. And so it's the impacts of climate change that need to be addressed in terms of adaptation, as well as climate change overall to be addressed in terms of mitigation. So both adaptation and mitigation are critically important. For Scope 3 emissions, it's really the mitigation aspects and the consumption and sales that are critically important.
Thanks, David. Touching on the, that recognition that the impacts are felt by all people, it's probably a good segue into another area of explanation that will come up, exploration in COP27 around, developing countries. So we've had a couple of questions come in on the Q&A specifically relating to the Pacific, but Sally, perhaps if I direct this initially at you, what kind of responsibility does Australia have in the international community to help developing nations transition to net zero?
Thanks, Anna. Well, I think Australia has a responsibility as a global citizen to both help countries transition to net zero, but also to support that adaptation and resilience piece that David so eloquently spoke about then. So, and climate finance plays a really critical role in supporting developing countries, both in the transition to net zero, but also with that adaptation support. So, under the Paris Agreement, developed countries, including Australia, have an obligation to provide and mobilise climate finance for developing countries. Australia, as part of the collective, is committed to achieving that collective $100 billion US goal. The developed countries collectively, we failed to meet it by 2020, which was the target. I think we got to 83 billion collectively. And I think partly we didn't quite get there because of the lower than projected private finance that mobilised as part of that goal. But that goal is projected to be reached in 2023. So we will get there. I think while the US $100 billion goal is politically symbolic. It really is only a small slice of what's needed to fund the transition to a sustainable and resilient global economy. That will require the shifting of trillions, really, and that will be an effort required from all sources. I think governments have a really important role to play here in working with partners, both public and private, to sort of shift and align financial flows with the goals of the Paris Agreement, and to use whatever fiscal and policy levers governments have to create that enabling environment for increased private sector engagement. So Australia absolutely recognises more needs to be done. There was a commitment at COP26 for Australia to double its climate finance commitment to $2 billion period. Around 700 million of that is focused on the Pacific, and around 70% of our climate finance has traditionally gone to adaptation and resilience. And Australia has largely provided our climate finance in a grants-based form. So we're very focused on providing that finance, also really focused on sort of effectiveness of our climate finance as well, ensuring that it's meeting the needs of the countries that it's going to, and achieving good outcomes. There have been some additional commitments, like I mentioned earlier, from the new government. There's an additional 500, like the design of that is still being worked through, but I anticipate that a significant part of that will be directed towards climate change. And then there's a new partnership, $200 million partnership with Indonesia, climate and infrastructure partnership there. So there are some new initiatives from this new government, so building on that doubling commitment from last year. So yeah, it's an extremely important part of the global transition and global adaptation to mobilise this finance, in particular to support developing countries.
Thanks, Sally. David or Natalie, did you want to comment on that?
Must be your turn, Natalie.
Okay. I'll kind of take a global tourism view. You know, for us, tourism is often about, these developing countries, whether it's the Pacific or lower income countries. And we're really seeing the impact in these places. So I think to hear of the work we're doing to kind of safeguard the more vulnerable communities, looking to our closest neighbours in the Pacific and Indonesia is really important for us, because it's where we are seeing, escalation of impacts from the changes that are happening. In terms of awareness, and hopefully everybody has moved beyond awareness, but to echo some of what David had said earlier, running a global travel and tourism business, every month we have an incident report. The incident report for September included earthquakes, volcanoes, flash floods, wildfires, typhoons, and a hurricane. Typically, we might expect any one of those every couple of months, but to have all of that within 1 month, it is absolutely there, and it's an impact to us as a business, but we particularly see the places these are happening. It's happening at home, but it is happening all across the world, and there are countries that are not equipped for it. So looking after, where we can support the more vulnerable and lower income communities to come on the journey as well and support them is really, really important.
Thanks, Natalie. David?
Look, I second everything that both Natalie's been saying and also Sally's been saying. Australia has a specific, connection and responsibility with Pacific Islands, but also there are important connections with, if you like, developing countries in the Southeast Asia, including Indonesia, Papua New Guinea, as well as countries like Timor-Leste as well. And Australia already has strong connections there as well. So the sorts of, if you like, application of climate finance to areas that countries that Australia already has connections. It's great to see that that's happening within Australia, but it's critically important to see that that funding is being transitioned and provided as urgently as possible, because both the mitigation needs and the adaptation needs are current and can't be delayed for very long.
Yeah, absolutely. Sally, when you introduced the topics, I guess, of COP27 earlier, you mentioned loss and damage, and would be good, I think, to explore that a bit further, because certainly we're seeing that filtering down through investor action in the corporate space. So would be interested in views from panel around where do corporates sit when it comes to climate change liability, and how does this play into broader approaches to climate risk? So maybe, Natalie, we might start with you, if you're happy to answer that one.
Yeah, it's probably an area where it's still relatively early in exploring, but as I just demonstrated, the impacts are real, to the business. And I think, we're working globally, doing the types of things that we do, we would always be set up to expect some impacts of this nature, but we have just seen it escalate. So in the regularity of occurrences of these types of things is just unlike we have ever seen before. But it's also what drove us to kind of get on the journey fairly early, but really looking at how do we what's the liability? How do we adjust the business for it? We're still probably pretty early in coming up with our strategy around that. But it is what has driven us to take the other steps that we have taken in terms of setting commitments, looking at reductions, and then starting to look at, well, what is the future of travel and tourism looking at like, and how do we kind of change what we do? We can't change it entirely, but where are opportunities to do things differently in a more climate friendly manner? So how can we kind of start pivoting the business without entirely giving up, what our core business is?
Yeah. David, did you want to comment on that one as well?
I'm very happy, or maybe I'm very unhappy, to be able to comment on this one. It is clear that loss and damage associated both with extreme events as well as with longer term changes associated with climate change is going to be a critically important aspect at the, if you like, international level, with companies as well as countries associated with substantial emissions of greenhouse gases being held to be liable for the impacts of climate change in developing countries, as well as also within a country, liability associated with emissions. Unfortunately, and I say this seriously, that's one of the topics of expertise that I have, the attribution of extreme weather and climate events to greenhouse gas emissions. And it is now that the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change's science assessment basically say that there are certain types of extreme weather events, like increases in extreme temperatures and heat waves, increases in sea level rise and storm surge related coastal flooding events, and increases in bushfire occurrence, such as occurred in Australia in 2018 and 2019, but have occurred in the last 2 years across North America, South America, Africa, and Europe, as well as Asia and Australia, that these sorts of extreme temperature events, heat waves, and bushfires are already being increased to unprecedented levels by human-caused climate change, and the liability lies with the largest emitters. The IPCC conclusions basically say that it is the cumulative emissions of carbon dioxide that lead to higher concentrations in the atmosphere, and therefore every tonne of carbon dioxide emissions adds to global warming and worsens the risk of extreme climate events.
Thanks, David. Sally, how do you see that topic around loss and damage playing out at COP27?
Yeah, thanks, Anna. I think it's going to be a really big topic at COP27. I mean, certainly losses and damages as Natalie and David have indicated, they're happening now. We are seeing losses and damages from both slow onset events and weather-related disaster events happening now. We absolutely recognise that there is a need for increased support and to avert and minimise and address losses and damages. Loss and damage has its own sort of article, its own place under the Paris Agreement. And there's been a mechanism established under the convention, which carried through under the Paris Agreement, called the Warsaw International Mechanism to discuss loss and damage. The Paris Agreement does provide some, I guess, protection against liability and compensation, but there is absolutely this growing recognition that there is this need for increased funding and support to deal with loss and damage. The Paris Agreement also outlines various areas of comes through to disaster preparedness support, through to humanitarian assistance after a disaster. And of course, a lot of what we do and how we work with the Pacific in the region does touch on those various elements. So we have a fantastic early warning system with the BOM in Bureau of Meteorology in the Pacific, and of course some regular providers of humanitarian assistance after disasters in the Pacific. But interestingly, what we're hearing from the Pacific, and I was in Samoa the week before last, where they're really seeing sort of a gap and a need is in planning for and responding to some of these slower onset events. So what happens when you lose your fish stocks, or what happens when sea level rises to the point that people need to migrate? So how do you plan for those slow onset events and then find mechanisms to respond to them? So that's thinking about this at the moment in terms of where they see a gap. At COP27, I anticipate that there will be an agenda item on loss and damage funding. There was a Glasgow dialogue established, which commenced in June, on loss and damage funding. This sort of sat outside the formal negotiations. I think developing countries, while I think it was a pretty rich and fruitful discussion that commenced there, found it a little frustrating that isn't linked to the formal agenda and therefore linked to a decision. So I think there's this interest, and I think it'll happen, is to have something on the formal agenda about loss and damage funding. So I think it will be challenging, though. I think it'll be a challenging discussion. There are some countries pushing for a new global funding facility for loss and damage, and we certainly recognise the need for increased funding. We're really concerned that any new facility or any new mechanism or mechanisms meets the needs of the Pacific, and that we're also making sure that we're making the use of all the existing mechanisms we have. So we're very keen to have this conversation, think about where the funding gaps and needs are, and how might be the best way to fill it. So I guess my short answer is that I expect it's absolutely going to be a feature of the agenda at COP27, Anna, and I don't know that it's going to be an easy conversation, but it's a good and important one to have.
Yeah, thanks. And just on that, what do you see? Obviously, there'll be a focus on government funding, but can you see the private sector having a role in this as well, in terms of sustainable finance and some of the what we're seeing in that space?
Absolutely. If you look at the funding that's required to, mobilise, that we need to mobilise to support the global transition, I think we really need to be looking at funding from all sources. That's not to say that governments don't have an extremely important role. They do, and particularly, there are some sort of activities that are really most suited to grants funding, and that's where governments can have a really important role. But we will need private sector investment to fund this transition. Will we really looking at how do you mobilise all sources to move the global economy to where it needs to be?
Yeah, Absolutely. Well, thank you all. We've just gone over 12 o'clock, so I'm really conscious it'd be great to get some questions in from the audience. So I'll just check. I know we've addressed a couple, but if anyone out there has got questions, please put them in the Q&A on your Zoom. I'll just have a look through here. Natalie, here's a question for you. You mentioned businesses need to be looking at emissions as well as adaptation. Could you reflect on approaches to adaptation you're undertaking at Intrepid, or any example of best practice you're aware of from other businesses?
Yeah, I'm not too sure about best practices, but what we're looking at, probably the bulk of our work has been looking on the emissions and that side of things, but we're also looking at what is the kind of travel of the future that starts addressing people's needs, still gives them opportunities to travel, but starts doing so, in a more environmentally friendly manner with less of an impact on climate the way we've been seeing. So we're kind of doing these things in parallel, and some of the steps we're taking, we just think trends in travel anyway, but going to slower travel. Out of Australia, again, we've got the tyranny of distance, which makes it more difficult, but across the Northern Hemisphere, we're doing a lot to kind of partner with slower travel organisations where to try and take away that need for long-haul flights to get places. Looking at partly, we started on the process of pivoting towards domestic, partly because of the nature of COVID, but we decided to stick with it because we think people are going to be wanting to do less long-distance travel. We know people are still going to want to travel, but giving them more opportunities to do shorter haul, less emissions involved in that, but really starting to work more towards the people-driven kind of transportation, a lot more trekking, a lot more cycling, a lot more low emissions types of products as we, adapt what we're doing as we go to the future. So we're not going to totally let go of the need to travel, the need to go long haul out of Australia. That's going to continue to be a core part of our business, but looking at what forms of travel can be done that are perhaps more appropriate to even kind of intersperse with that longer haul travel going forward. So it's a little bit of an example.
Thank you. We've had a couple of questions around agriculture come in on the Q&A, one of which is, will the government engage in the breakthrough negotiations on agriculture initiated during COP26? And there's another question that's related around how we're going to keep the ag sector engaged and consulted. So I don't know, Sally, David, between you, if you want to answer that one.
Sally, did you want to go first, or would you prefer me to go first?
I don't. I'm happy to jump in. So I guess just in terms of the breakthroughs, I mean, Australia was very engaged in the breakthrough agenda at COP26. I'll have to be honest, I have to probably take that one on notice. I think that was from you, Jana. On where the ag breakthrough is, and get back to you, have a chat to our ag negotiators on that one. I think there's some really great opportunities for Australian agriculture at COP27. I know we've got the National Farmers Federation coming along, Meat and Livestock Australia, Australian Forest Products Association coming to COP. There is an Agriculture and Adaptation Day, and that's a really great opportunity for Australia to kind of share its stories about work that the Australian agricultural industry is doing to try to reduce emissions and adapt to climate change. I mean, emissions reduction in agriculture is one of those really gnarly challenges where I think we will get some real benefits from having that international collaboration and exchange. Obviously, there's some work happening, under the Powering Australia plan through some, research and development initiatives into feed supplements to look at how we can reduce culture. I know that we've got industry, MLA, really taking a leadership role in some of their own net zero targets. So I think our international discussions, and we've seen them actively engaged in some of our stakeholder sessions in the lead up to COP. And I think
Sally, we
this
might
COP in
just
Egypt is a really fantastic additional opportunity for that. Food security and agriculture is obviously a really high priority for Africa, and Egypt is really prioritising that. So I think COP27 is a
Sally, we might just jump across to David.
You're
just you're just lagging a little bit, Sally. David, did you want to have to comment on that agriculture and perhaps even more broadly biodiversity and how that will be addressed through COP27?
Yeah, sure. And look, let me start by saying that agricultural emissions are critically important in not only Australia, but many developing country related emissions as well. And land clearing in the past has been a major contributor in some developing countries to emissions and continues to be important in some states in Australia. And so keeping vegetation, if you like, growing, that is already growing is critically important, and is critically important as part of nature-based solutions to retain and then increase the amount of forest cover and vegetation cover. But there are important opportunities in thinking about new approaches to agriculture to increase soil carbon levels, not only in Australia, but in all countries around the world. European and so-called Western styles of agriculture have led to major loss of carbon in soils around Australia and in many other countries as well. So what we've now need to think about are the so-called nature-based solutions or regenerative agriculture solutions that not only increase agricultural productivity, lead to more trees and vegetation on land, shift away from broad-scale ploughing, but include retention of agriculture, in retention of trees along watercourses and riparian zones around creeks and rivers. We need to regenerate as much forest and vegetation as possible, because that will extract carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and either store it in vegetation or store it in soils. And there are many win-win solutions that regenerative agriculture can lead to increases in productivity and increases in carbon capture and storage, as well as better protection against extreme rainfall and protection against erosion and flooding. So there are many good things to be gained, not only in Australia, but also in developing countries from these changes in the approaches that are being used in agriculture around the world and in developing countries and in Australia.
And from a COP27 perspective, David, are we expecting to see that kind of discussion around biodiversity loss and nature-based solutions at the forefront?
Look, I'm expecting that, but that depends a lot on, if you like, the government views. But it's clear that Meat and Livestock Australia and the National Farmers Federation are very much involved in these sorts of active discussions of being part of the solution, not part of the problem in Australia and in other countries around the world.
Yeah, thank you. Sally, this is probably a question for you that has come in around, is there a list of attendees? So does the government have a list of Australian organisations attending? And if so, are there plans to share this information or facilitate collaboration between the groups going? I know you mentioned earlier you put some websites up. Is that the best place for people to go for that kind of information?
Yes, I think so. Can you hear me okay now, Anna?
Yeah, we can.
Oh,
yeah.
Okay, great. Sorry about that. Yeah, I think the website is the best place to go. We'll have to just consider privacy considerations before sort of sharing information about it, attendees in particular. But we will plan to have a welcoming event at the Australian Pavilion on the first, early in the first week, probably on the Monday. So that's a good opportunity to come firsthand and see who else is on the ground and make those connections. Also on our website, we'll be publishing the events program for the Pavilion, which will include the organisations who'll be there. So both of those opportunities will give you a fairly good clue as to who will be on the ground in Sharm el-Sheikh. And just to sort of add to the importance of nature-based solutions, we actually talked to Egypt very early on in their presidency about having a focus on nature-based solutions at this COP, and I'm really pleased to see that one of the presidency's initiatives in partnership with the IUCN is on nature-based solutions. It'll be a strong feature of our Pavilion, including the role of First Nations people in nature-based solutions. Australia's had a pretty strong focus on blue carbon in particular, the mangrove salt marsh seagrass restoration work that can happen that supports both adaptation and mitigation. So we'll be sharing some of those experiences at our Pavilion, but also through an official site event at the UNFCCC as well.
Terrific, thanks. This one's probably for you as well, this question. Is reducing subsidies for fossil fuel industries part of the government's current plan? And what are the risks associated with this?
I probably don't have anything really more to say on fossil fuel subsidies at the moment. I think the best I can offer on that really is this commitment that the government has made to become this renewable energy superpower, and really looking at how do you really ramp up that industry to become sort of a really good source of income and economic growth for Australia, that then supports this sort of orderly transition away from fossil fuels.
Yeah, thank you. I think what I've managed to get through most of the questions that have come in on the Q&A. I'm very happy for anyone who's got any last minute questions to send them through. In the meantime, before we get to any of those additional questions, I'd just like to ask each of the panelists if there's one thing you would like to see happen during the upcoming COP negotiations that supports your aspirations and vision for future policy, climate policy advances in this space, what would it be? What's that one thing? We might start with you, Natalie.
Tough one. To come down to just one thing, I think it really is all about ongoing action. To reiterate what we said at the start, I think seeing where the new government has gone, and Sally very much made it clear that the new target of 43% is the floor, but just to see us continue, we've come to the table now, we've come out with new commitments, which is great. Just like to see us continuing to push that further, and really have Australia step up as we had wanted for previously. We're seeing it starting to happen, but having this as the first step of an ongoing commitment from Australia to both the region, but to step up and transition towards, we can be a powerhouse in terms of this renewable energy, and we've taken the first step. Let's just keep moving in that direction, I think.
Thanks, Natalie. What about you, David?
Sure. And look, what I'm going to do is sort of try to emphasize something that I think is not emphasized as much at COP meetings. COPs have been focused through the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change on mitigation action, on reducing emissions and targets for reducing emissions. But it's critically important to recognize that climate change is happening now. We've talked about it all of us around the impacts of climate change on extreme weather events, as well as slow and progressive action. And that means that climate change adaptation to the impacts of climate change is needed now, not tomorrow. It was probably needed 10 or 20 years ago, but is critically needed now. And that means that climate finance for adaptation action is even more important, as well as climate finance for mitigation action. So I guess I'd love to see greater emphasis at this COP on climate change adaptation action, particularly in developing countries, but also climate change adaptation action in Australia.
Thanks, David. And what about you, Sally?
I'll start by saying I think David's wish will come true. I actually think that this COP will have a very strong focus on adaptation. The Egyptian presidency is very focused on it on behalf of Africa. So I really think adaptation and adaptation finance will be front and centre at this COP. I guess what I'd like to see is less division between developed and developing countries. I'd really like to see this enhanced cooperation on common challenges, and that recognition that we are all in this together. We all need to work together to increase ambition, to meet our collective targets and keep the temperature goals of the Paris Agreement in reach, as well as David said, adapt to the impacts that we are feeling already. So that's what I'd like to see.
Terrific, thank you. Now I'm conscious of time, but we've just had one further question come through on the Q&A, and it's not an easy one, but I guess it is a topical one around just transition. So, what can corporations and governments do to support the just transition while stemming the increasing cost of living and inflationary pressures on households? So I don't know who wants to tackle that one first. I guess maybe from a corporation perspective, a business perspective, Natalie, if you wanted to comment on that one.
Yeah, it's not an easy one.
No.
But look, I think from a corporate perspective, we can't use the cost of actions as an excuse to not do it. And I think the other thing that's happened, it's a part of business. It's impacting our businesses now. So, we really have to get away from excuses and, talking to a lot of SME businesses, their first question or the blocker is, well, how much is it going to cost? And we've got to get past that. I think, it also doesn't need to be extremely costly, and it doesn't need to flow on to the consumer, at least in the industry that I'm working in. I'm sure there are other situations. But it has just got to be included as the way we do business now. It is the reality that we're living in. It has to be central to a strategy of how is this business, whatever business you're in, going to do business. It's got to be integrated into the strategy of how you work. And it is the new way of doing business. It doesn't always have to be as expensive as I think businesses assume that it is. I think that's often a blocker, and you've actually got to get past that. Because while there might sometimes be upfront investment, that can be recouped later. It can't be a blocker. But it's clearly going to vary across industries in the way that it needs to flow on, and it impacts the cost of living as well. But I think we've got to stop using that as an excuse. We can't risk taking action. We've just got to get in there and we've got to do it. So I don't know if that's answered the question, but it's kind of a sidestep to the question.
It's a difficult question. Any sort of final comments from either David or Sally before we wrap up?
Look, I think that this question actually is critically important, but there are many things that both businesses and communities and households can do that will actually reduce the costs of using traditional energy sources. And so what we've got to think about is the way that the increase in renewable energy, solar panels, wind power, subscribing to those and shifting away from using fossil gas as an energy source in homes or in businesses, shifting to renewable energies will actually save money now and avoid the future costs of increases in fossil electricity and in the use of fossil gas as an energy source. So renewable energies have, the great benefit that the actual costs, while their capital costs are high at the beginning, the ongoing costs are essentially zero, because to most people, sun and wind are free. Yes, the distribution costs will still add to that, but it's critically important to recognize that the best way to avoid increases in future fuel costs is to shift to renewable electricity and have that on your roof or subscribe to renewable electricity. And that applies to businesses. But there are a couple of other things we can do to reduce costs, and that is to recycle and reuse materials as much as possible rather than to buy something new. Get whatever you're using repaired or maintained as long as possible, rather than just buying something new.
Some great points, David, and good reminder, I think, to do that as well. Sally, did you have any final comments?
Well, both very excellent answers from David and Natalie. I would just like to reflect, I guess, this topic was very live at pre-COP in Kinshasa, particularly for the EU, who are going into winter, with the energy security challenges they have at the moment, with people genuinely concerned about how they're going to heat their homes. But the EU was very clear that we can't solve the energy crisis at the expense of solving the climate crisis. We need to do both. And while we might have some short-term blips in that trajectory towards net zero, all of this reinforces the importance of making that transition and moving to the more sustainable sources of energy. I'll leave it there. Thank you, Anna.
Absolutely, thank you. Well, I think we've got about 2 minutes left. So I think in closing, I'm sure everyone listening in has found it really useful. I know I certainly have, and I think we'll obviously be following with interest what's up on the website, Sally, that you mentioned as we follow the COP negotiations next month. Some of the key takeaways for me around the topics being discussed, obviously that piece around equity and also finance and the role for both private and public financing. I think the adaptation piece obviously came through quite strongly, and importantly the collaboration and input of First Nations people as well, and really respecting their knowledge around the natural environment. So I might just leave it there. Thank you very much to everyone who has participated today, and obviously a very big thank you to David, Natalie and Sally for giving up your time and speaking to us all today. It's been really, really insightful. A big thank you as well to the team at the UNGCNA who do a lot of work behind the scenes organising things like this webinar. There is a survey that you can complete at the end. So there's the little code up there that you can use. So it's really helpful for us to get that feedback, so we know what you're interested in, we know what works, what doesn't, and what you want to hear about in future webinars. So on that note, I will draw to a close. Thanks again to everyone for attending. There will be a recording that will be available, I presume, on the UNGCNA website, so watch out for that. But yeah, thank you very much and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.